Let's take a look at what's grabbing headlines here in France. And Florence Villeminot joins me now here in the studio. Good morning to you, Florence. The French Finance Minister Michel Sapin has been unveiling the budget for the year 2017. That's going to be the last budget of this presidency, isn't it?
That's right. And the right-wing daily Le Figaro is a little bit skeptical about this budget, which it says is a little too optimistic. Le Figaro says that with a growth forecast of 1.5% and a public deficit forecast of 2.7%, the government is more optimistic than most economists and big institutions. And so you can see the front page of Le Figaro here. It's un dernier tour de passe-passe. This is the final trick before the 2017 presidential election. It's essentially a budget that's full of very costly electoral gifts and essentially tax breaks. But it's really interesting. That's the right-wing point of view. If you look at the left-wing or far-left point of view, it's also very critical of this budget. This is L'Humanité, the communist paper. It has a very different interpretation, but equally critical of this budget. With the 2017 budget, L'Humanité says it's clear that the government is playing the austerity card until the bitter end of the presidency. This obsession with austerity has clearly marked Hollande's complete 5-year term.
Okay, so on the one hand, they're trying to cut costs and as Humanité would say, go down the austerity road. But another initiative is to try to resolve this problem of overcrowding in French prisons, and that's going to cost money, isn't it?
That's right. That's another thing that's been laid out by the government this week. You can read about it once again here in L'Humanité. This is the Justice Minister, Jean-Jacques Urvoas. He wants to put forward a plan to create between 10 to 16,000 new prison cells by 2025. Of course, France is quite notorious for having overcrowded prisons. Now, as you said, this is going to cost a lot of money. You can get those details once again in L'Humanité. It's going to cost between 1 to 2.5 billion euros. Now, the idea is that by 2025, 80% of prisoners will have their own prison cell. And this has been a goal for a really long time. In France, it's been a goal since 1875. So it seems like a good idea, but L'Humanité is still disappointed with this plan to create new prison cells, this great leap forward, this race to build. L'Humanité reminds readers that in their point of view, incarceration is a failure. And the more prison cells you build, well, the more you're going to fill these prison cells.
Yeah, and it's not by any means the first time we've talked about this problem of overcrowding in French prisons. You said this goes back to 1875. More recently than that, however, I can remember talking about this on air, and looking at reports precisely talking about this issue.
That's right, and promises to create more prison cells. This is something that comes up time and time again. Les Echos, the business paper, takes a look and says, there have been these kind of ambitious plans for decades. In fact, over the past 30 years, there have been these kind of plans, but they've never succeeded. And Libération, the left-leaning paper, agrees and says, this promise of individual cells has been made for quite literally over a century now. You can see they're talking about the return of the endless promise. Instead of flogging this dead horse, there are other priorities, according to Libération, which quotes one of the main prison unions here in France. It says that the real thing that we should be working on is not creating more cells. It's actually helping prisoners get back into real life, if you will, the rehabilitation of former convicts.
Okay, so two different views on how best to go about that. But moving on now into the world of French politics a little bit more deeply, and the former president and possibly the presidential candidate in 2017, we don't yet know, Nicolas Sarkozy, facing some sharp criticism for some comments he made. What's he said this time?
Well, he was talking about Gaulish ancestors. You can get all the details in Le Figaro, which comes back on those comments he made. This was at a rally on Monday. Now, what he said is, when you become French, your ancestors are the Gauls. If one wants to become French, one lives as a Frenchman. We will no longer tolerate an integration that doesn't work. We demand assimilation. Now, do keep in mind that Nicolas Sarkozy is the son of a Hungarian-born Frenchman and a French-born mother of Greek-Jewish origin. So these comments coming from him have raised a little bit of eyebrows. But what's interesting is it's not the first time that Sarkozy has declared his love for France's Gallic past. Just in May, he quoted a historian who said, "There's a certain poetry in our ancient history. We need to fill young people with this poetry to fortify their patriotism. Let's make them love the Gauls and our druid forests." And so you can see Le Figaro coming back on this love of the Gauls from Sarkozy. Now, a lot of papers are saying this love is actually just purely strategic. And if we take a look at an editorial in Les Echos, it's saying that essentially Sarkozy is trying to set the pace, and especially he's trying to provoke his main rival, Alain Juppé, get him to play his game. And Les Echos says, it seems to be working because Alain Juppé quickly reacted to these comments saying, assimilation is wanting everyone to be identical. When you cut the roots of a tree, the tree dies. We're not all the same. Les Echos says it seems like Juppé is falling into Sarkozy's trap, but you can see it's not Sarkozy, it's Sarkozix, which is a play on words, of course, with Asterix, the very famous Gaul, well, fictional Gaul.
Yeah, I was going to say, difficult to mention the Gauls without mentioning Asterix, and that's put Asterix in the spotlight as well.
That's right. Libération actually has a very interesting article, a very serious article about the adventures of Asterix and his sidekick Obelix, which, this story did really help romanticize the story of the Gauls and the resistance against the Roman Empire in the 1st century before Christ. But Libération says it's really weird to use the comic book series to defend Sarkozy's idea of France. Because if you read Asterix, and indeed the reason why so many people love Asterix is because Asterix spends his time traveling around Europe and helping people who are in danger. And he also spends his time embracing people's differences and realizing that that is what makes people stronger. So it's weird for Sarkozy to be talking about the Gauls. But who were the Gauls, actually? This is something that's come up in the press as well. We're talking about the Gauls, but who were they? And there's a great article I really recommend in Slate today that talks about everything you don't know about our ancestors, the Gauls. For instance, they practiced slavery, human sacrifices, polygamy. Slate wonders, is this really something that's worth bragging about? It seems like Sarkozy might be playing a dangerous game, the game of chasing after votes on the far right. And let's just end with one cartoon. This is by Willem in Libération. You can see Sarkozy playing a very perilous game here, riding 2 wild horses, one from the left wing, far right. I wonder if Asterix could do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Florence Vimino with a look at today's French headlines.